discussing is the euro saved and is it worth saving with Laurence Boone of Bank of America Merrill Lynch. She joins us from London. We're talking with Julia Cage, economist at Harvard University and the Paris School of Economics, Thomas Clough of the European Council on Foreign Relations, and from Bayonne in southwestern France, Laurent Pinsol, spokesperson for Debout la République, a political party that espouses leaving the Eurozone. Now, speaking of leaving the Eurozone, just a couple of your reactions on Twitter. Daniel from Canberra in Australia writes the following. I was quite attached to the franc, mark, shilling, and lira, he says. On Facebook, Omar writes, imagine the amount of money that France has spent on Libya, billions of dollars which can be used to reduce your country's unemployment rate. So the question of how you distribute public funds is obviously always one that's at the fore. I'd want to pick up on what was said just before the break. The idea that perhaps Julia Cage, we're moving towards necessity being the mother of invention, that Europe is perhaps making baby steps towards some kind of more some kind of decision-making process that makes more sense to investors. So that was the point there taken by Laurence Boone. Your thoughts on that?
I don't really agree. I am not sure that the investors find sense to the fact of creating some fiscal solidarity. At the end of the day, there is no fiscal decision in what is deciding today, since there is no tax at all on the banks or on the societies.
On the companies.
On the companies, yes. I think they are finding some sense in the fact that they are not going to pay too much, that they take a huge place in the decision process, especially in imposing the possibility of having some rollovers on the debt, especially on the fact of not having any tax. And it should be great to have like a new vision of a more federal Europe. This is a possibility. Perhaps we are going to see that tonight with the FESF. This is not sure at all. And I think the main thing that we can see today is that the financial markets are still the master of the game.
Thomas Clough, your thoughts?
I'd take a guardedly but slightly more optimistic view, potentially, of what we're seeing today and what we've seen over the last year. Clearly, it's still wholly insufficient. Clearly, we're far from getting the kind of fiscal and budgetary architecture which a monetary union like the one which the euro forms needs to be really stormproof in the long term. It's dropped out of the public debate, but there is the negotiation underway for the package of economic governance, the new rules to replace and expand the Stability Pact. Personally, I'm very skeptical that this will work. I think we need to move towards a proper European budget, something much bigger than the 1% we have now, 10%, 5%. I think we need to move towards accepting that the European Union has the power to raise taxes, tax and spend, that we get automatic stabilizers at EU or Eurozone level. We are far from that. That said, I think this crisis has confirmed the old truth or old rule that in a time of serious crisis, what we see is an advance in integration. It's happened painfully and messily, but decisions like the one to create the EFSF, and indeed it will be very important to see today to what extent it's being expanded and made more powerful, more flexible, are the principle that if a situation happens like the one in Greece or in Portugal or in Ireland, somehow it is a matter for the common concern of all. These decisions were born out of necessity, of course, but certainly, if you'd put the question to any German government 5 years ago, could we see a scenario like the one we've seen over the last year? Could we see the kinds of decisions we've seen? The answer would have been absolutely not. So it's not terribly encouraging in the sense that would have wished for more political ambition and much bigger steps, like the affirmation of the launch of a proper Eurobond market, for instance. We've seen midget steps in the right direction, and it's not the end of the road, and it shouldn't be.
Laurent Pinsol, do you agree with Thomas Clough? Do you see the glass half full at the end of the day's proceedings?
I don't see things like Thomas. I do agree more with Julia. In fact, I do not agree with the baby steps towards federalism. 9 months ago, I was discussing here about Eurobonds and a doubling of the FSF. And it's still on the table. Nothing has moved forward. So I think the situation is currently completely blocked. And this plan is only handling Greece's situation for 2 years. It only buys Europe some time, but does not solve any problems. If Spanish and Italian interest rates were to jump, a new plan would be needed. And hopefully, for me, Germany is strongly refusing any move towards political and economic integration. And with time, as the cost of the plans is increasing, German opposition to integration is growing. Thus, I think the situation is completely blocked and federalism won't happen.
Thomas Clau?
That is factually untrue, I would say, because it's very important to realize that now the German opposition, the Greens and the Social Democrats, are united in pressuring the German government to do more to further integration, to accept, for instance, Eurobonds as one of the key part of the necessary answer to the crisis we are now in. And there was a very interesting and important press conference by the 3 potential nominees for the top slot of the Social Democratic Party, the German one, in the next federal elections, who jointly said, if Angela Merkel comes home to Berlin from Brussels with an important agreement, and she doesn't find the majority within her own parliamentary group and her allies, the Liberals, the Social Democrats are there. So, no, it's not true that Germany as a whole is getting more and more Eurosceptic. The opposition is now clearly espousing, if you like, a more federalist approach.
And even Angela Merkel is doing some progress on that. Like 2 days ago, she did a press conference in Germany saying that we are not the one that do not want more Europe. We are fighting toward progress. We are going to do the necessary for Greece not to have to leave Europe.
But Julia Cagé, every one of those countries that have initiated the painful restructuring plans have been routed at the polls, like in Portugal, and basically there's a general lack all around of confidence in European leadership, it seems.
Yeah, they're pretty bad. Like, they took more than 2 years, to have this summit and to take good decision. Like, they took 4 months last year to decide to save Greece, which kind of explains the current Greek situation. Right now, they took more than 2 weeks. Like, the summit was supposed to take place last Friday, to organize a meeting. We now have a meeting, but there is still not very clear decision, like the creation of a Eurobonds market. We have pretty bad political leaders in Europe. This is a bad thing, because I think that more Europe, more federalism, and more integration will be the good solution.
All right, not everyone agrees. We can perhaps look at some images from Madrid from Wednesday, where the so-called Indignados rallied. In this particular instance, it was to block the eviction of a 55-year-old mother of 2. This part of pressure on politicians to help 1 million Spaniards currently struggling to pay their mortgages. Elsewhere in southern Europe, similar fears.
We are expecting help from France and Germany for the good of Greece, and so that we don't drag the rest of Europe down. Italy, Portugal, and after that the euro. The euro will fall and we will end up returning to the drachma. I don't think today they're going to find a solution, but I think at least it's a good step, because there has to be an answer.
It's bad, bad, bad. Worse than ever. What other solution do these politicians have? If they don't solve the country's problems, people will cut their heads off.
Cut their heads off, she says, that woman in Lisbon. We can take a look at the front cover of French daily newspaper Libération ahead of the summit. And there you see it, outraged Europe, it says. And on its inside pages, there are reports from Athens, Madrid, London, all of them reporting on how ordinary citizens are revolting against the system. And in its lead editorial, the paper concludes that the project of a federal Europe needs the consent of its citizens. But for its people, the EU today is simply synonymous with belt-tightening and austerity, not progress and protection. Thomas Clau, it's one thing coming up with a deal in Brussels, it's another selling it to the voters.
The trouble with Europe today and the Eurozone, politically, is that we have a system that is both terribly inefficient as Julia was saying. I mean, decisions take ages to be reached. They're often reached as the lowest common denominator. So it's not efficient and it's not democratic because the political decisions that are taken, for instance, by the Eurozone leaders or by the European Council, cannot be impacted by any meaningful popular European vote. People vote in European elections, but that only affects the politics of the European Parliament. So voters do not have the feeling that the people who are meeting in Brussels today have, if you like, a collective European mandate to do certain things which they can then be punished for in a vote 4 years later or 3 years later or 2 years later. And that's a big problem because it undermines the legitimacy of what is being decided. More and more important issues are being settled at the European level, which they have to. And the European level gives guidance and in some cases instructions to what happens at the national level. And there is a disconnect. So I think we need a reform of the European system which makes it both more democratic, more transparent to the voters, and more efficient. It's a win-win situation, and we are now in a lose-lose situation. And one way to do that, I think, would be to inject the normal game of party politics, opposition and majority, into the process of decision-making and anchor institutions like the Commission in the classic democratic game of being either, if you like, centre-right or centre-left, describe it as you will. Because what we have now in Europe is de facto an all-party coalition in the Commission and in the European Council, the Swiss model, but we don't have the Swiss safety valve of constant referendum. So we have Switzerland, an all-party coalition with no referendum. That's not very democratic. Voters don't like it, and it undermines the legitimacy and therefore the efficiency of the decisions that are being taken.
Laurent Pinsol, if there were changes, if ordinary citizens had more say in what goes on at the Commission level, would you review your stance on the euro, on Europe?
No, because I think that a single currency does not fit a region that is so heterogenic. The countries are too different to share the same currency. There is the optimal currency zone theory by Robert Mundell, a Nobel Prize of Economy, that says that there are 3 conditions to have a single currency in the same zone, and neither fits the Eurozone, whereas they fit in the US. And I think that's the trouble with the Eurozone. It could never have worked. We are seeing it right now. And even more federalism would just help the Eurozone to continue some years, but in the end it would not work because what Greece needs is a devaluation of 30 to 40% against the mark and the franc. And it's not attainable within a single currency.
You know, I'm sorry to tell you that this is completely false. If you look at the data and you compare, different European countries, and then you make the same comparison between different states in the US, there is first less income differences between European countries, like for example between like Greece and Germany, than between like American states. And then, even if you look at the way like incomes vary together, there is less volatility in Europe than in the US. So, if we want to agree with you, the good conclusion would be that we don't want one money for the US, but like we want 50 different monies. So
I do not agree.
No, that's true. Like even Trichet recognized this fact. This is an empirical fact that has been proven. You just have to look at the data. There is less differences in income between European countries than between American states.
So just a quick answer from me. There are 3 quick criteria for the common optimal zone. First, the labor mobility. Labor mobility is far lower in the Eurozone, whereas versus the United States. There is no federal budget in the Eurozone, whereas there is a federal budget in the US. And third criteria, the convergence is not happening at all in the Eurozone. For example, there is a minimum wage of 200 euros in some places in the Eurozone, whereas it is more than 1,000 euros in other countries. So the difference is far bigger within the European Union.
You don't have to look. You don't have to look at the minimum wage. You have to look at the average income. Like labor mobility in the theory is necessary in order to create convergence, Since there is more convergence in Europe than in the US, your only conclusion can be there is not enough labor mobility in the United States.
All right, let's just move on a little bit because we're almost out of time. And I want to just broach one more point, which is sort of running parallel to all of this, which is we're talking about how to share the burden when it comes to helping these sovereign states. We're talking about the private sector. And we see at the same time how markets last week were underwhelmed by last Friday's stress tests of major European banks. Share values of financial stocks took a thumping through most of this week amid a general feeling that banks are still too big to fail. The Financial Times, in its lead editorial, ripping into the European Commission for trying to cap how much money banks are forced to keep in their coffers. It makes sense for member states to be allowed to impose higher capital standards when necessary. After all, it is their taxpayers who will end up footing the bill if a bank fails. And it brings us back, Laurence Boone, to the question that we set out earlier. And again, Julia Cagé was saying how from what's emerging so far out of Brussels, it looks like the banks are getting off with a slap on the wrist.
I mean, we are not sure yet what's going to happen, right? I think one of the points of dissension is effectively what the form of the private sector involvement will be. There is one issue with having so much financial integration and having at the same time the financial system holding so much of the sovereign debt. In an ideal world, you would like to disentangle what banks are doing from what the states are doing. But the fact is banks hold their national sovereign debt, and this is a huge problem for Greece at the moment because it has a lot of Greek sovereign debt on his books and on his balance sheet, and there is this relationship between the states and the bank. Now a lot of regulation, especially in the US or in the UK, is striving to kind of disentangle the situation and have on the one hand banks that the sovereign state can guarantee, but which is not doing risky investment business. And on the other hand, banks that do investment business, which are risky and which are not guaranteed by the state. And it's probably one of the good outcome of this crisis if the regulation manages to distinguish these two and state guarantee banks that do not take so much risk and protect basically the taxpayer money, their savings, their pension. And on the other hand, those who are taking risk, they're not protected, but you know that you take risk, you may have a higher return, but then you're by yourself if something happens. It's extremely difficult at the moment. I think at the end of the day, there will be some form of private sector involvement. To what extent the private sector will be affected is difficult. In all fairness, it's probably easier from an administrative point of view to impose a tax with a large base on all banks. It's probably more difficult to try and make a buy-by work. In all fairness as well, it would probably be easier to do better for Greece to do buyback because you would directly reduce the amount of debt that Greece has to pay back, and that's where the private sector would pay. Greece would be better off, and the banking sector can probably bring the amount which is targeted for that, which is about 30 billion euro at the moment.
All right, so a work in progress in terms of how to make banking boring again and how to save Greece and how to save the European Union's further designs for integrating the Eurozone. I want to thank you, Thomas Clow. I want to thank Julia Cagé, Laurence Boone for joining us from London, and Laurent Pinsol for joining us from the great city of Bayonne in southwestern France. Thank you for being with us for the France 24 debate. Still to come, business news with Marcus Carlson. He's also watching with a keen eye all day what's going on in Brussels as we still wait for that final communique. Stay with us.